So let's get into it. Objective 1 of the 70-532 exam says create and manage Azure Resource Manager virtual machines and is worth 30 to 35% of the exam grade. So 1/3 of the exam is focused on this section and the following sections, so you need to pay some special attention, obviously. So let's talk about Azure Resource Manager first. There are actually two portals, two websites that you can go to manage your Azure subscription and to create and manage resources. What we're looking at here is called the new portal. It's available at portal.azure.com. Now, the new portal uses the Azure Resource Manager model for managing resources. What that means is that basically resources are grouped into resource groups. So we can actually go back here, see that they have resource groups, and if I have a number, I have 6 groups here. I can go into them and I can see resources that are associated with this group. So we're looking at a network security group, an IP address, a virtual network, a couple of storage accounts. And all of these are assigned to the Scott's new resource group. Resources can only ever be assigned to one group. And so this is a convenient way for administrators to manage the resources inside that group as a whole. So I can see here there's an access control tab against the resource group, and so I can manage access to that set of resources at the group level. And we'll get into that when we're talking about security. But you can see here that there's the owner has full admin rights, owner rights, and I've created a developer group, which is only read-only rights. There are also be able to manage costs for these resources, and you can see right now it's not costing me anything, but I can see on individual server basis how much things are costing, and that makes it easier for your tracking and billing when you've got a lot of applications running on your account. You've got scripting, you've got monitoring, alerts. Certain people can be alerted when resources events happen and limits are met and things like that. So logging, all that wonderful stuff. So a lot of stuff happens at the resource group level, and that is the signature of the Azure Resource Manager model. Now, there are still this classic portal, and if you look at documentation on the MSDN Microsoft website, you can see here that there's 3 sets of documentation for this topic. There's the Azure Portal documentation, there's Azure Classic documentation, and then there's even an older Classic Legacy documentation. Okay, so even the Classic interface has changed such that they need to have 2 sets of instructions. And this exam focuses on the Azure Resource Manager model. You need to understand that the Classic model exists, but Microsoft is rapidly moving stuff from the Classic portal into this new portal, and very rapidly the Classic portal will go away. And so the exam focuses on the Resource Manager model. And so when you're studying it, you should be creating your virtual machines and your web apps and your app services all under the new portal. So the first sub-requirement of the Objective 1.1 says identify workloads that can and cannot be deployed. So we want to talk about virtual machines. So a virtual machine is Microsoft's offering for what's called infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service is basically what allows you to replicate what you might have be running in your own data center or on your own premises as a virtual machine. Okay, so you can see here that if I go into the virtual machines tab and I start adding, I've got the option for Windows Server, Red Hat Linux, Ubuntu, SQL Server instance. Go into here. There is CentOS, Debian, Docker, lots of options. There's actually Red Hat, dozens and dozens and dozens of options. Okay, so you can see companies besides Microsoft are offering their software and their hardware as this virtual machine sets. And so besides a pure Windows operating system, you can spin up other like firewalls. So ThreatStop has a firewall option. So when we're talking about Linux and Windows, there are certain workloads that you might be running within your own on-premises environment or your own data center that do make sense to transfer to Azure and don't make sense to transfer to Azure. So, for instance, Azure only supports certain versions of Windows Server. So there's a Windows Server 2008 R2, there's Windows Server 2012 R2, and Windows Server 2016, and Windows Server Essentials. Okay, so if you absolutely require a version of Windows Server that is not on this list, then you're not going to be able to spin up a virtual machine within Azure to run that. Okay, that's one restriction, is your operating system version. Also, if you've got Linux or any specific version of Linux that needs to be supportable from Ubuntu 12, 14, 16, it has to be a Ubuntu 8, then again, not an option. So that's the first thing, is if you've got versions of software that need to be supported, it may or may not be supported. The second thing you should know is we're talking about virtual environments. We're talking about performance of an equivalent machine that almost has to be a little bit less than the equivalent machine that you might be running locally. Let's say you spin up an A2 instance. I went to Microsoft's site, pulled out a Windows pricing here. Say you spin up an A2 instance. It's got 2 cores, gives you 3.5 gigabytes of memory and 60 gigabytes of disk. Now there's a price associated with that. But if you need 2 cores, but you need way more memory, so let's say you need 32 gigabytes of memory minimum, then you are looking at, there's basically high memory instances. So let's go down to here. You can see there's a 56 gig option, but that gives you 16 cores, and the price is a lot more expensive. Okay, so almost 10 times as much. So if you've got a very specific hardware requirement where you don't need much CPU, but you need a lot of memory, you're sort of stuck with those options and the pricing that's associated with that. Even if you find exactly what you need, you might be in that limited, 10% of people whose software and applications are perfectly optimized to be running within your own local environment at that piece of hardware. But within a virtual environment, you might not find the same performance. You might find that running at 2 cores with 100% load all the time has some side effects, and you're going to have to adjust based on that. So physical hardware has some advantages when it comes to RAM, disk, number of operations per second. Now, you might be surprised how close they are, because these things are highly optimized. And so they've done extensive testing, millions of instances. If you're running a very, very high efficient use of that particular machine, you might not be able to reach that level of efficiency. The other thing to note is if you need, let's say you want to get this Windows version, you've got Windows Server 2008. Let's say you already have a license for that, and that comes with some other thing that you purchased, and you want to reuse this license. Well, you don't really have an option within the interface here to say, well, I already own it. Okay, here's my license number. So if you want to spin up a Windows Server, there's a cost associated with it. That cost includes the cost of Windows, and you can't say, well, I only want the machine without Windows and I want to install Windows myself, or I want to apply a license that I already have access to. So you're going to have to work out with your pricing, your licensing of Windows, that you have this many copies for your own use in the company, and you're going to have to pay Microsoft through the Azure portal for licensing their software there. Finally, the other types of workloads that are not great for these virtualized and cloud environments are anything that you have a very specific configuration or software installation need. So for instance, within the virtual machine here, Windows runs off the C drive. Okay, it always runs off the C drive, and you cannot choose to run Windows off a different drive. Your data disk will not be the C drive. And so when you're getting a virtual machine that has an OS disk and a data disk separate, your data disk will be a different directory letter, and you can't say, no, I absolutely need there to be a C drive, or I absolutely need there to be C :/temp /my app. It's a fixed right location. It has to be there. If you've got those kind of requirements and you're not flexible for the configuration of software, then you may have to test that. So basically everything else would make, if you've got an application that runs on Windows Server 2008, basic things, it's a website, it's a service, those things are pretty perfect for running within virtual machine environment. It's only that sort of less than 10% of the usages which are very, very specific to a very, very specific configuration. And unfortunately, you have to conform to the standards that are being set here. That is workloads that can and cannot be deployed.